When Trump announced in July the stockpile of Bitcoin, the national stockpile, that got the attention of a lot of Republicans. A lot of Republicans look to Trump for policy leadership on issues, and so they might be on the fence or not really know a lot about Bitcoin. But if Trump comes out and says something positive about it, well, that's going to incentivize them to go do their research and to understand why is Trump taking a favorable position on this. And so that's what happened here in Texas. And so they realized that Trump was correct, that it does make sense, and it makes sense at a federal level, and it certainly makes sense at a state level for the same reasons.
Welcome back to The Culture Bit. On today's episode, we have Pierre Rochard, Vice President of Research at Riot Platforms, one of the largest miners here in the United States. We touch on everything from the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve, the latest XRP and Brad Narlinghouse drama, as well as some stateside Bitcoin policy talk, and then, of course, a little bit of mining in there. Pierre's going to be speaking at Bitcoin 2025 later this May. So if you enjoyed today's conversation and want to catch more of him, you can secure your tickets at b.tc/conference, and you can use code BM10 for 10% off at checkout. Now to the show. Pierre, absolute honor to have you back on the show today. I think this is the first time we're doing it formally in video, which is super exciting. But I figured today, as I do with all my guests, even though I am very familiar with you and many Bitcoiners are very familiar with you, there are a lot of net new people to the Bitcoin ecosystem that may not be familiar with who Pierre is and what Pierre does. So let's set first principles and a baseline here. Who is Pierre?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, Pierre is an accountant. So I started. I really got interested in Austrian economics when I was in high school. So first and foremost, I was a libertarian into sound money. In particular, what I got interested in was this concept of the business cycle. So why is it that the economy has these big macro booms and busts? So that led me to reading a lot about money and banking. And then when I was thinking about what I wanted to study in college, accounting seemed like a very reasonable adjacency to that. And I didn't want to do finance because it seemed like it was not as principled as accounting is. I'm, kind of a logical person. So did that, got my master's and bachelor's at UT Austin. My last year of college or graduate school, I got to meet Michael Goldstein and Daniel Krawietz, and they changed my life. They are the ones who orange-pilled me and got me really interested in Bitcoin as a better form of precious metals. So, up until that point, I was stacking silver, and then I realized that hey, there's a better alternative out there, and really kind of went down the rabbit hole, as everyone does when they get interested in it. It led me to learn about programming. So when I was in high school, I really got into free software and Linux and open source and kind of the philosophy behind it, even though I didn't really learn how to code at that point. But I was listening to Richard Stallman lectures about why users should be able to control the code. So Bitcoin really fit into a great intersection between monetary economics and free software that clicked for me really, strongly. And I've been obsessed with it since. Done a lot of different things. I worked at BitPay in Atlanta and payment processing for Bitcoin. I worked in high frequency trading, which was pure fiat. That was nothing Bitcoin related, but that was during the bear market where, your best move is to mine fiat. And then I worked at, then I took a break, worked on open source software, worked on Lightning, got a really successful piece of software out, which was called the Node Launcher, which was the first way for people to easily access the Lightning Network from a desktop computer. From there, joined Kraken and got Kraken on the Lightning Network. So we got millions of people access to a custodial Lightning wallet, which people really enjoyed a lot. And then Elizabeth Warren decided to attack the Bitcoin mining industry. So Riot brought me on board to help provide a forceful push in the other direction. So I went out, I hired our head of public policy, Brian Morgenstern, to kind of build up a really solid um, organization that, in combination with industry groups like Texas Blockchain Council, like Digital Chamber of Commerce in DC, but also, with lobbyists and with just grassroots education to really go against two parts of it. One was just the pure environmental argument of the carbon emissions from Bitcoin mining, and then the second, which I think is equally, if not more important, is the value of Bitcoin, because ultimately, if you only see Bitcoin mining as a cost with zero benefit, then yeah, it doesn't make sense. But explaining the benefit was very important, and I think that it's interesting because all of this laid the groundwork then for the victory that Trump had in November, and also the um, more widely accepted view that Bitcoin should be in something like a strategic reserve. Because we had spent 2 years explaining why Bitcoin is valuable to politicians. And yeah, that's going to have an effect beyond, oh, we shouldn't ban Bitcoin mining. It's like, maybe this is something that we should take a closer look at. So I think that Elizabeth Warren's attack on the mining industry was a cell phone. Bitcoin's anti-fragile in that way, and so everything that's thrown against it, like a judo move, gets kind of redirected into a more positive direction. So yeah, that's kind of been my journey in a nutshell in Bitcoin.
Yeah, I feel like you haven't done enough, Pierre.
I
What
know I
more
need to work
could you do?
harder.
No, absolute Chad of a player within the Bitcoin ecosystem. So accountant turned, coder turned policy expert, working on all these various projects. You have a very robust background, and so you understand kind of the not just the culture of Bitcoin, but the value propositions and the things that have brought resilience to the network over the cycles of Bitcoin. And the reason why I bring that up, right, is we're in a really interesting time period where you've been through the fork wars, been through the China mining ban, been through all the FUD on Capitol Hill with Choke Point 2.0 and those sorts of things. And now we're at the stage where Bitcoin is in popular culture, it's in politics, it's in traditional finance, and we're speed running a lot of these old talking points again, just in mass very quickly. And yeah, so I wanted to get into all that, but before we do, let's jump a little bit back to the last time you and I connected, which I think was maybe November for the election coverage.
That's right. Yeah, I flew up to Las Vegas to be with the Bitcoin Magazine team, and an ensemble cast of policy experts that y'all brought together to talk about the election results in real time as they came in that evening. And I think that everybody was really surprised by the outcome, but also, for the most part, relieved that the mining and the wider Bitcoin and crypto industry were going to have a much more favorable regulatory environment. But yeah, that was a great time in Vegas.
Yeah, it was certainly, it was funny. It was one of those, the Trump administration winning the election was one of those things where I think everyone expected it not to happen, but knew it was going to happen. And then it finally happened. And for all of us, it was like a sigh of relief for maybe a day. And then it was like, all right, we have a lot of work to do. SBR, proper policy in the White House, and that sort of thing. And certainly, even the last 48 hours has been anything but, relaxing. I think we had a tweet on Sunday from President Trump that had announced the continued forward momentum of what was the strategic Bitcoin reserve is now turned into the strategic crypto reserve. And in that initial tweet, he talked about Ripple, he talked about Solana, I think he talked about Cardano, and
Mm-hmm.
no mention of Bitcoin at all. And so rightfully so, all the Bitcoiners started freaking out. And then who knows? Barron maybe gave him a call. He was like, "Dad, you got to fix the tweet." You know, the memes go around, starting like, "You got to fix the tweet." Send out something about Bitcoin. And so he did. He issued a correction. But it's definitely a stark departure from a lot of policy campaigns that he was running on. I know he promised on day one an executive order bringing in some Bitcoin buys potentially to supplement the strategic Bitcoin reserve. There's been talks of a sovereign wealth fund integrating Bitcoin, and now obviously the expansion, including other baskets of cryptocurrencies within it. Pierre, I know you and Riot as a whole have been kind of at the forefront of policy, more so on the mining side, but overall just advising the current administration on best practices here. Walk me through the process, maybe starting with the election and to where we are now. How have we gotten to the point where we've deviated from a Bitcoin-only strategic reserve to a basket of cryptocurrency strategic reserve?
Yeah, I think it's really it comes down to coalition building, right? That we need as much allies, as many allies as possible to advance our priorities, and then it's a matter of kind of the technical aspects of what it ends up shaping like. So, if we go back to what Trump's initial promise was in Nashville at Bitcoin 2024. Excellent conference, by the way. And the promise was that the Trump administration, if elected, would not sell the Bitcoin. And so then that was, quickly followed by a speech by Senator Lummis highlighting her bill, which goes even beyond that and suggests, that we would acquire Bitcoin. And it was definitely framed as Bitcoin only. I think that the challenge then in terms of implementation is if you have people going to Mar-a-Lago and saying, "Hey, either you make this a crypto reserve that does not, how they frame it is they don't want the government to pick winners and losers, and so." From their perspective of this maybe multi-coin ideology, they see this as like, if the government only endorses Bitcoin, then that is going to further drive the wedge between even like number one and number two, right? The Ethereum's already very far behind Bitcoin and is falling further behind. And in many ways, I would argue that the altcoin industry, that is everything after Bitcoin, is struggling, and is not necessarily struggling for regulatory reasons, but is actually struggling for fundamental reasons that they have not found compelling use cases that actually drive demand for holding their tokens. They have a huge overhang of supply of essentially VCs unlocking their token supply. And all various other technical issues of how good is the actual technology compared to Bitcoin, where in many ways, like we saw with the Ethereum Bybit hack, it's things where they made technological choices that make their systems less secure than Bitcoin is holistically. So all that to say that then it's also, if we look at not selling, right, the government doesn't actually hold any XRP. So for Trump to promise that he's not going to sell any XRP, that's a wonderful promise, and it's might cause the day traders on Sunday to bid up XRP, but ultimately it doesn't affect the flows, and the reason why the government has not seized any XRP is because nobody actually uses it, right? So if the government wants XRP, I think that what they should do is ask Ripple to donate it. Perhaps that would be a way to acquire XRP, in the same way that they seized Bitcoin. But then we have to go into the practical conversation of, would they actually buy XRP? No promises have been made there, right? So I think that it really just depends on whether Brad Garlinghouse is able to get criminals to use XRP and to get it seized through the legal process. Interesting question. So I think that we have to kind of look at it practically of what's actually going to play out, and also what are the incentives here, which is, Trump, he wanted to, um, he, some have said that he looks at the stock market, he pays close attention to financial markets, financial conditions. They've talked a lot about interest rates. They want to bring interest rates down, and they want to make sure that the crypto market is thriving. And what we saw over the past couple of weeks was kind of a um, a crash, frankly, in the wider crypto markets, Bitcoin included. And so it kind of made sense to try to talk up the market. And, this is something that we've seen past administrations do with the stock market, with, other situations, including, for example, like Silicon Valley Bank, right? You come out during the weekend, you say, hey, we're going to do this and that, make some promises, and then that helps alleviate financial conditions. Now, why was the crypto market crashing? Some pointed to the tariffs policy. And so for the Trump administration, it's kind of a balancing act of, okay, we want to help bring manufacturing back to the US, but we also don't want financial conditions or crypto market conditions to suffer from it. And so they have to kind of provide messaging on both ends. Um, so we've round tripped. So now, even though they put that out, Bitcoin's back to where it was before the announcement, maybe even a little bit lower. And I think that this shows that at the end of the day, it's about actual buyers and sellers, right? So the cash flows of money going in and out of the market, you can only try to influence the price with announcements to a very short extent, but it has to be backed by actual actions. And this is where I think that we need legislative action on the Bitcoin Act to get that passed. And that, what I would say to Brad Garlinghouse and others who are trying to influence, their bags, a rising tide lifts all ships. Okay. So, if we get the government buying a lot of Bitcoin, the whole market is going to rise with it. And they should say thank you and be grateful for that rather than trying to undermine it or to sabotage it because they have this big ego and they feel that the government should be acquiring XRP in addition to Bitcoin, or that it should not be acquiring anything. And, it's like they would rather, cut their nose to spite their face type situation, rather than just accepting that Bitcoin's the king. It's going to continue to be that way, and that they need to kiss the ring.
So there's a lot of directions we could go here, and I want to double back. I hate saying this. I can't
No,
believe we're talking about.
You can. It's okay.
I can't believe we're talking about Ripple and XRP in 2025. It's like the ex-girlfriend that just won't go away for whatever reason. But I was listening to you talk on Nico's show, Simply Bitcoin, a couple weeks back, just talking, running through the audience, just the history of XRP and why it's still stuck around, a lot of the marketing efforts they do, and kind of the tokenomics behind, being able to print their own token and dumping on retail to get their logos like up on presentations with banks and that sort of thing to kind of create this sphere of influence. So maybe let's start there. And the reason why I want to focus on XRP real quick is just, I know you have been in the last couple of months very outspoken against Brad Garlinghouse. I know XRP did the Greenpeace piece. I don't know, was that a year ago or so? At this point,
a couple years ago.
But, obviously you have specific interest against that piece because it was attacking the Bitcoin mining industry. So maybe let's start with the Greenpeace piece, and then let's get into this kind of interesting banter back and forth between you and Brad going on in Twitter.
Yeah, so I want to first actually start with the SEC litigation against Ripple. So I actually agree with Ripple. I don't think XRP is a security. And in fact, reading the legal filings persuaded me of this. And the fundamental reason why XRP is not a security is because Ripple is, not making any promises, and that when you buy XRP, Ripple doesn't owe you anything, and that's why XRP is fundamentally worthless. So the reason why it's not a security and why it's worthless are the same reason, which is that you're not owed anything, and so that's where then okay, XRP is not a security, that's fine, but is there some kind of misperception that Ripple is creating that they essentially the retail investor is equating XRP with some kind of equity interest in Ripple and the work that they're doing with banks, and that they're going to pump the tokenomics by having partnerships with banks? Um, and that's kind of like the ecosystem theory that the SEC has. I think though that at the end of the day, it's that the XRP is going to lose in the market, right? In the free market, it's going to lose, and it's going to lose because of the monetary economics. So that part is let's kind of just close that out, because I don't think the SEC should have gone after Ripple, and that essentially they made a martyr out of Ripple, and so now when Brad Garlinghouse, he can go to Trump and say, hey, look, like Biden was performing lawfare against my company, and you should have some sympathy for us. That's an effective argument. So that's really an unfortunate situation. And so, okay, so then when the SEC came after Ripple, I think that from their perspective, they were like, okay, well, let's drag everyone else into the mud with us. So let's give $5 million to Greenpeace to start smearing Bitcoin and create this dichotomy of Ripple is environmentally friendly. And so thus the Biden administration should stop attacking it with the SEC, and that Bitcoin is destructive for the environment. And thus the Biden administration should focus their efforts on Bitcoin. And, it's like, okay, we're competitors, right? Let's be clear. XRP is competing with Bitcoin. Let's not equivocate on that point. I think that's pretty obvious to anybody with any sense. And that all's fair in love and war. And so, yeah, let's get in the mud and let's wrestle. But it goes to the point that Brad then pivots to, oh well, Trump won. And so instead of promoting CBDCs and environmentally friendly stuff, let's start saying, oh, we're all in this together. Bitcoin maximalism is bad. And Pierre's a bad guy for pointing out that we were enemies like 5 minutes ago. And so it's just very disingenuous on his part. Again, I understand it. He's got his economic interests. That's fine. But my biggest disagreement with Brad and Ripple is really on the philosophy of centralization versus decentralization, right? So first with that, the reason that Ripple XRP is environmentally friendly is because it's centralized, and that Ripple can completely change the rules of the game any time of the day. So then they pretend otherwise. I kind of consider that to perhaps be some form of constructive fraud in some sense. I'll let the lawyers decide on that, but I don't care either way, because at the end of the day, they're going to lose on the free market anyway. So I'm not saying that they should get sued or anything. The other part of it too is that the value versus utility argument. So their argument is that the value accrues to whichever token has the most utility, and they define utility as kind of this hodgepodge of ideas like remittances or interbank settlements, essentially where you can move dollars around on their ledger and then you pay the fees in XRP, and that gives XRP value, or that you can have meme coins on Ripple. XRP, is providing kind of the infrastructure for that and all this. So they're constantly chasing the latest narrative in order to try to argue with retail investors that Bitcoin has zero utility, it's a pet rock, and that Ripple has lots of utility, and that you should buy XRP. And I think that's a I think that's a perfectly fine debate to have. Just like Coca-Cola versus Pepsi or something like that. Or I would argue more like Coca-Cola versus water. I'm saying like water is better for you, and you should buy water. And they're saying Coca-Cola, you're gonna have a fun time with Coca-Cola. It's cool. You should drink that poison. So it's fine, but it's yeah, that's where I think it's a lot of fun to debate on Twitter with them, and also to point out all of the nonsense that they have. Like they lost the first 50,000 ledgers. It's like, hey guys, like don't pretend that you're some kind of strategic asset when you're just like a very basic bottom of the barrel S coin.
A perfect way to summarize it. And I appreciate you walking us through everything on the background there. And I don't disagree with you. I'm people can say I'm biased just because
Sure.
leaning towards being Bitcoin only and Bitcoin maximalism. But yeah, I think the free market will ultimately decide the success and fate of Ripple and XRP. And I think ultimately that it's going to trend towards zero. I think it's inevitable, just given on the fact that it's not sound money. They're shit at being anything like ETH or Sol, and even ETH and Sol's value proposition isn't even great at all. And I don't really want to get down that rabbit hole, but yeah, I think the inevitable trend is towards zero. But I think we can't just discount it and stop the conversation there, right? So what's interesting about all this is that yes, Brad successfully got the ear of Trump. He got the tweet on Truth Social saying that XRP would be included in the strategic crypto reserve. And so if our assumption is that XRP is going to go to zero, and let's just say the Congress passes either Lummis's Bitcoin Act or the crypto whatever legislation needs to happen for the crypto reserve, what are the implications for that reserve if XRP goes to zero? Are there any negative ramifications, or is it kind of just a blemish on the history of the reserve?
Well, I think that from their perspective, that when you diversify and you put different assets in there, you're saying we don't know which ones are going to do well and which ones are going to go to zero, and so that's why we're doing that. And so we expect some of them to not do well, and we expect some of them to do very well. And so it's kind of almost like a VC portfolio idea, which David Sachs is a VC. Like that's how he thinks about the world. Um, and that as Bitcoiners, like we see it very differently. And as a monetary economist, I see it very differently. But it's we got to go out and make the argument. And I think that maybe the strongest argument, and one that I've been pushing, is that 94% of the Bitcoin have been mined. We don't know what percentage of the XRP has been issued. On its face, the claim is that half of them have been issued, basically, that Ripple is going to continue to sell $1 billion worth of XRP per quarter at current prices. And then the big question is, okay, after they've sold all of the XRP, don't they have an incentive to add more XRP to the ledger? Because they're saying there's only going to be 100 million XRP or 100 billion or whatever it is. Doesn't really matter. And so why would they, when they run out of XRP to unlock, they can just change the number and they can add more. And it's not like anybody can go and say, oh, we're going to hard fork and, we're going to be on a different ledger, because Ripple owns all of the intellectual property around it. And so there would be no practical way to actually say, we're going to continue with the original XRP and Ripple is on the XRP Classic fork, right? That's just not feasible. And so for the strategic reserve, the assets should be scarce assets, not abundant assets. And it goes also into the direction of gold versus oil. We have a strategic reserve of oil so that we can use it in an emergency. what do we need to use XRP for in an emergency? Right? Like, what kind of emergency calls for XRP? You know, you're like on a plane and somebody's having a seizure, and you're like, does anybody have any XRP here? It doesn't make sense. For Bitcoin, the strategic purpose is that it's decentralized, and so in an emergency where, for example, let's say New York and Washington D.C. have been nuked, and so there's no dollar anymore, right? That eliminates the dollar. Let's be clear: the dollar would not exist in that scenario. Then we have a fallback mechanism. But if San Francisco gets nuked, that eliminates Ripple and XRP. So there's no fallback mechanism there as well. So I think that from a strategic perspective, it also comes down to the distribution globally. North Korea does not mine XRP. China does not mine XRP. Russia does not mine XRP. Why do I bring this up? Some people might say, yeah, it's good that XRP is only made in America, right? That's the argument that Brad makes, is that we should buy made in America. That does not make any sense from a strategic perspective. You want to buy what is globally demanded. What do our enemies want? What is neutral money, right? And so from a weapons perspective, if I told you, okay, is it strategic to have nuclear weapons? Well, yeah, because everybody wants nuclear weapons, so we want mutually assured destruction. And so now, is it strategic to have a tactical clown car? No, nobody wants the clown car. Okay, that's XRP. So, I could go on with the metaphors, but I'll stop.
No, I love the metaphors. They're great, and they illustrate the point very well. Yeah, I think, to sum it up, right, XRP has no utility. Why are we including it in this basket? I think ultimately it'll be priced out. So it will be a nothing burger in the long term. But one thing I do want to start talking about here, that I feel like has been out of the public discourse since Trump has gotten into office and in his cabinet has gotten into office, is the original promise of Bitcoin mining in America and having all the remaining Bitcoin mined here. And Pierre, as the VP of research at Riot, I think you have some interesting perspectives. You've been very close to the source and the man himself as it pertains to these conversations. And we briefly started to touch on it here as far as other nation states mining. There's obviously a lot of synergies with, the Trump administration looking to bring back manufacturing to the U.S., specifically, diversifying out of Taiwan and chip manufacturing. There's a lot of intersections between mining and high performance compute. Obviously, Riot's at the forefront in Texas with your guys' massive center. So with the background there, I guess the preliminary question that I want to ask is, where is the conversation in DC as it pertains to Bitcoin mining and, the federal government supporting mining activities as a whole?
Yeah, I think that it has essentially been subsumed into the overall HPC AI conversation and the energy dominance conversation. So, from this administration's perspective, like, they want the U.S. to have as much electricity as possible and as much, advanced technology like AI as possible. And then for the Bitcoin mining part, I think that they see that as okay, how do we pay for all of this, first of all, right? So Bitcoin mining has really even paved the way towards having these massive scale data centers. They've proven out the concept that you can do this. I think that before Bitcoin mining, the overall data center industry kind of have thought that you could only do 30 megawatts. Like, they weren't thinking big enough. And that the Bitcoin miners had kind of the ambition to actually think much bigger than the industry had before, and also with different technologies, right? So looking at, for example, immersion cooling, or single phase or two phase immersion cooling, and doing that at scale. And so the density, the power density, and the cooling technologies have been pioneered by Bitcoin mining. Now, in terms of the future growth of the industry, when we look at announcements, whether it's announcements publicly from Riot of, hey, we're looking at HPC AI to do our second phase in Corsicana, or other publicly traded Bitcoin miners, clearly there's a dynamic where the revenue from doing AI is currently greater than the revenue from doing Bitcoin mining. Why is that? Well, because AI is more differentiated in the marketplace. So, it's not a commodity like hash rate is. Hash rate's a global commodity. Anybody in the world can mine. And so that makes it a far more cutthroat market from a profit margin perspective than the AI side. So I think that kind of explains the current dynamic, and that it's great in the sense that it also has helped a lot with the environmental debate, right? Where even if you don't think Bitcoin mining has any value, you certainly have to admit that AI has value. Otherwise, you're just a Luddite, right? It's like, oh, okay, you want us to live in mud huts. Okay, got it. And so I think that it really has just completely removed that line of argument of this is Bitcoin mining is too energy intensive, and that's a problem, because then it's like, okay, well, what about AI? It took the wind out of the sails, on top of just them not being in power anymore.
So on the global stage, so yeah, thank you for the background on all of that. I think a lot of the FUD that was around Bitcoin mining is kind of out the door, to your point, right? You can't be in favor of high compute centers for AI and that sort of thing. And then, on the backside, be like, Bitcoin mining's bad, it's bad for the environment, right? Especially as we're talking about a strategic Bitcoin reserve. The two go hand in hand with another. You can't place Bitcoin within that reserve and then not also have a plan of action to be mining it stateside to supply said
Yeah.
reserve. One of the things that I have found particularly interesting that hasn't really been chatted about here stateside, and it's something that El Salvador has done, within their own government, is leverage, their geothermal activity to mine Bitcoin, right? Are there any conversations happening in Washington where, similar, you said earlier, like, is there a strategic advantage to the US having nukes? Clearly, yes, for our defense. Is there any conversations being had at the federal level in terms of, maybe the government spinning up its own miners and using its own resources stateside to prop up the reserve?
No, I haven't heard anything along those lines. I think that they recognize that, when they look at the Bitcoin miners and they see us buying Bitcoin on the spot market, and then they're like, oh, okay, maybe it's more effective to do that than to go try to compete with existing miners. And so ultimately, I think that's, how it's going to play out if they go in that direction of going beyond just holding the seized Bitcoin. They'll buy it on the spot market, and yeah. So I think that where there is a strategic interest is on the energy side of government subsidizing other forms of power generation. So you mentioned geothermal. That's really interesting because there's actually geothermal opportunities here in Texas that are being explored. And there, the argument really is like, okay, currently natural gas is the most cost-effective way to power and to generate electricity, but the price of natural gas can be volatile. And so we want to have like an all of the above approach of, yes, we're going to have coal, natural gas, wind, solar, batteries, nuclear, geothermal, using every technology because each one has trade-offs and each one is more cost effective at different times.
So in a nutshell, it's the classic US mantra of letting the private sector handle this type of innovation while subsidizing power costs for the private sector to do said work. Yeah. I guess the reason why I asked the question in the first place, right, is there's a lot of attention on the global stage as it pertains to Bitcoin. On the mining side, I know Russia's come out and said that they're mining it, right? And so my mind goes to is like, well, oh, why isn't the US mining it? Well, it's like, well, we have some of the biggest miners here now stateside. And then on the flip side, there's rumors circulating around that China has been very much considering their own strategic Bitcoin reserve, right? And we all know the history with China and the Chinese mining ban. I'm sure they're looking at the actions that took place in 2021 and being like, man, we really fumbled the bag here on this one. So yeah, I guess that was the crux of the question on the backside is like, I think the US needs to, if they're not already, maybe potentially be doubling down on, whether it's power, subsidizing power for these miners or having a more strategic plan of action there in place. I don't know. What are your
Yeah,
thoughts there?
I think that globally, there's so much hash rate already online that even if you're Russia, like they've got to have ways of buying Bitcoin if that's their intent. Now, if their intent is just to monetize the energy assets and they don't have any other way of doing it, um, then yeah, it's a way of essentially trying to uh, make a couple bucks by using the free natural gas, or in China, the free hydropower that they have. Um, and so it's really about making sure that they're monetizing assets, not about the fact that they're trying to accumulate a strategic reserve of Bitcoin.
That makes sense. Okay. Where do you see things going then? Federally here, or I guess even in the private sector, right? As these high performance compute centers start to come online, how does that complement businesses like Riot,
Yeah.
companies like Marathon? Do we see more centralization of hash rate here stateside, or do you think it's going to continue to be distributed out globally?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that first of all, they're very different load profiles from an electrical perspective. So Bitcoin mining is a lot more flexible and can turn it on and off far more quickly. And so for that reason, it's pretty complementary. In that essentially you could say, okay, if electricity prices are high for an hour, we turn off the Bitcoin mining. If they're high for 3 hours, we turn off the AI data center, right? So it provides kind of a buffer from an electrical perspective. And then, from an economics perspective, it's all about doing what's best for the business and for, the overall creating value for the shareholders. And so that's where, it's funny that Bitcoiners have been kind of hand wringing over this idea of, well, what happens when the subsidy, the new Bitcoin being issued, gets cut in half? Doesn't that mean that transaction fees have to go up? And the reality is that no, it doesn't mean that at all. It means that the businesses that were earning that revenue have to find other sources of revenue, and they don't have to be related to Bitcoin at all. There's no rule that says, hey, once you start mining Bitcoin, you can't enter into any other line of business. And so it kind of puts that FUD to rest. It raises the question of, okay, is there some kind of minimum amount of Bitcoin mining needed for the network to be secure? And I'd argue no, not at all. That let's take the absurd argument of let's imagine a world where there's basically like a nickel's worth of mining reward per day, and so you have one guy in his underwear in his parents' basement mining on his laptop, and you have trillions of dollars worth of Bitcoin being settled by this guy. Okay, so what's the negative outcome? He starts censoring transactions, right? He's like, oh, okay, I don't like BlackRock. I'm going to start censoring their transactions. What does BlackRock do? They say, oh, our transactions are not getting into blocks. Let's attach a higher fee and submit that to the mempools around the world, and let's try to get into the next block. So the guy in his parents' basement still does not, but somebody else on the network is like, wow, these transactions are accumulating in the backlog. They've got pretty high fees. I'm going to start mining because the difficulty is very low. So I'll start mining on my laptop and I'll reap those rewards. And boom, it's like mining is permissionless no matter how few people are mining Bitcoin. And this is actually very different from proof of stake. So with proof of stake, if you have one staker, they can choose to not allow others to stake. And so it's a closed permission set. With Bitcoin mining, that's not the case. It's permissionless. So it doesn't matter if all of the Bitcoin mining is being done by one person or one mining pool, all it takes is for them to misbehave, and then that introduces competition, and Bitcoin's anti-fragile that way.
And hence why it's the apex asset for the strategic Bitcoin reserve.
Yeah,
That's a whole.
absolutely.
I'm doing a horrible job at tying in all these topics together, but I'm trying my best here.
Yeah, you're doing great.
One thing I do want to get into, because I know we're getting close to the top of the hour here. There's been a lot of talk at the federal level. Obviously, Bitcoin mining is always a super interesting topic for me. But we haven't had a chance to talk too much about state level strategic Bitcoin reserves, which has also been receiving a lot of attention here domestically, stateside. I know you recently, testified at the, I think it was the Senate
Correct.
the Senate state hearing in Texas regarding their own strategic reserve. And the interesting thing about this conversation is, like, obviously there's benefits to the states, but I don't think any of these are talking about integrating any other asset. I know some have failed. I think Wyoming was the first one to not pass. But Texas has always been very pro Bitcoin, especially on the mining side. I know a lot of miners are located in Texas. I know a lot of homegrown miners are also located in Texas, just due to, Texas having its own grid, cheap power, and that sort of thing. But yeah, walk me through the Senate hearing there. What's the conversation shaping up like for Texas's own strategic Bitcoin reserve?
Yeah, absolutely. So, when Trump announced in July the stockpile of Bitcoin, the national stockpile, that got the attention of a lot of Republicans. A lot of Republicans look to Trump for policy leadership on issues, and so they might be on the fence or not really know a lot about Bitcoin. But if Trump comes out and says something positive about it, well, that's going to incentivize them to go do their research and to understand why is Trump taking a favorable position on this. And so that's what happened here in Texas. And so they realized that Trump was correct, that it does make sense. And it makes sense at a federal level. And it certainly makes sense at a state level for the same reasons. And so the legislation was introduced in the House by Representative Capriglione, who's been really at the forefront of innovation. He heads the Innovation Caucus in the House, in the Texas House. And so he's been a thought leader on Bitcoin, on blockchain more broadly, on AI as well. And so he introduced it, and then it got introduced in the Senate by State Senator Charles Shortner, who's a great man and the chair of the Business and Commerce Committee. And then really something really interesting happened, which is that the lieutenant governor, he's kind of like the leader of the Senate in Texas, he came out with his list of priorities for this legislative session. The Texas legislature meets every 2 years, and so you have to prioritize for 6 months, right? Because they only meet for 6 months, and anything that doesn't get done does not get done for 2 years. And so he put together a list, and number 21 was Bitcoin mining, the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve. And so that was really interesting, and it signaled that the lieutenant governor himself, this is coming from the top, wants this to get done this session. And so they very quickly had a hearing in the Business and Commerce Committee, which has jurisdiction over this question. And of course, I went to the hearing, both to provide my own perspective, but also to hear what others were saying, whether it's the senators or other witnesses at the hearing. And what I heard was really interesting. For many years, people would lecture Bitcoiners about, hey, don't call Bitcoin a currency, right? That's going to antagonize the politicians. They don't want Bitcoin to replace the dollar, and so don't say that Bitcoin's going to replace the dollar. Don't suggest that they're competing. Okay, so I walk into the hearing room, and Senator Shortner starts laying out his reasons for why he thinks Texas should have a strategic Bitcoin reserve, and essentially he says, what if the dollar goes to zero? There's so much inflation; it's outside of our control. We need an alternative currency that we can turn to that's sound money. And I'm just like looking around like, okay, that's really interesting because for years we had people lecturing us that we shouldn't say this because it'll antagonize politicians. And here are politicians saying it. So I think those people were really myopic. They were short sighted, right? And they were very naive. They were far more naive than the Bitcoiners, actually, because they didn't realize that politicians are intelligent people as well. And a lot of them don't have a vested interest in the dollar, and they realize that the dollar's in trouble and that, God willing, Doge succeeds and balances the budget. But what happens if AOC gets elected in 4 years? It's like you're having to trust people with very different interests. In particular, the state of Texas does not have a money printer, right? So we don't get to decide what monetary policy is in DC. And so if conservative politicians in Texas have a different perspective on inflation than Janet Yellen or whatever, then yeah, we're going to want to chart our own path and to take matters into our own hands, right? And to take ownership, take responsibility for the citizens of this state. And so I thought that was really fascinating and kind of confirmed something that I had thought, but to hear it actually being said, I thought, it really, it reassured me, but it also, I don't know, it annoyed me that I was like, I can't believe all those people were so wrong for so long. And they'll continue to be wrong. I don't think they're going to learn anything from this, but that's fine. Okay. And then the other thing that I thought was also funny was the opposition to the strategic reserve came from two demographics. One was altcoiners who were like, oh, Bitcoin's obsolete. You should not buy Bitcoin. And the senators were like, okay, why is Bitcoin obsolete? And then these guys, they can't help themselves. They just start babbling technical gobbledygook that it like doesn't make any sense. And I've been, studying Bitcoin for a decade, and like I was trying to track what they were saying, and it didn't. It was just a word salad, as we say. And the senators saw through that, and the senators told them, I don't know what you just said. Maybe like write it down or something. I don't know. Okay, next person. And then the next person was the environmentalist from Sierra Club. And he said, oh, Bitcoin is like a cookie that has real sugar, and Ethereum is like a cookie that is artificially sweetened, and it's healthier for you. And the senators were like, is it healthier for you? I don't know about that. Okay, anyway, next person. I was just like, so that's it. That's the opposition. Just two people who don't have anything intelligent to say. And so then they voted 9-0. Bipartisan. Texas Republicans and Democrats voted for the strategic reserve. Every age, right? You've got senior citizens on, there, and you've got younger senators as well. It's just, I found it fascinating. So I'm very bullish on Texas passing this ultimately. And it was really, really cool to be in that room.
That's so many incredible sound bites. I'm sure that you just wish you could just bring up on just repeat. And that's going to be super satisfying too. Just, like to your point earlier, saying that, for years you've been told, hey, don't antagonize the politicians about sound money. And then here they are saying everything you believe and know to be true and correct, finally coming out. That's going to be such a satisfying moment for you, Pierre. I know we're at the top of the hour here. Last question I want to ask you, if you have some time real quick. You're speaking at Bitcoin 2025. Maybe it's too early for me to ask you like what you're speaking on, but maybe some insights into that. And if you don't know yet, where do you see kind of things going here in the short term? We're less than 100 days out from the event. Feels like 1,000,001 different things could happen, but what are some predictions? What are you going to be speaking on?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of surprises along the way. And I think that, ultimately it comes down to the fact that after a very long period of Gary Gensler trying to prevent Bitcoin from integrating with the financial system, Now we have regulators who are a little bit closer to reality and are willing to find ways to actually make sure that this asset gets used to its highest potential from a financial perspective, and then also from a peer-to-peer, payments perspective. And so I think that that's really where the focus is, and that's probably where the focus will be of what I'll speak about.
I'm super excited to just see. Hopefully by then we have a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Maybe not, but there's certainly going to be tons of interest. Just at the global stage perspective, the policy perspective, the energy perspective. It's always an amazing event. It's always a pleasure to run into you there as well. So looking forward to hearing you speak. Where can people find you?
At Bitcoin Pierre and in Las Vegas. So hopefully everybody gets their ticket and flies out. It's going to be a great time. It was a great time in Nashville, in Miami, in San Francisco. And I think Vegas is going to really take it to another level.
Absolutely. Well, Pierre, it's been a pleasure this morning. Looking forward to catching up with you next time.
Thank you, Al. Cheers.
Cool.